For 35 years, I managed the roaring diesel veins of Gable Logistics, building a multi-million-dollar fleet from a single flatbed truck. But when my late husband's chair was barely cold, my 3 children gathered in the boardroom and voted to strip me of my executive authority, calling my operational wisdom relics of a slower age. They thought a mother's devotion meant quiet surrender. They were wrong. If you want to watch how a mother silently constructs a rival empire to reclaim what is hers, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. When those you carried in your body decide you are nothing but an overhead cost, how far will you go to show them who actually built their world? My blue-bordered ceramic mug has a small gray chip on the handle, exactly where my wedding ring used to knock against the clay when I drank my coffee during the 5 o'clock dispatch runs. I held it in both hands, feeling the steam rise against my face, watching the digital clock on the microwave transition silently from 4:59 to 5 a.m. For 35 years, 5 o'clock was the moment the first wave of flatbeds cleared our main gate, their air brakes releasing with a heavy metallic sigh that I could hear from our back porch. It was a beautiful, dirty sound, the sound of 40 tons of freight beginning to move across the state. But this morning, there was only the low hum of my refrigerator. I set the mug down, opened my laptop, and clicked on the shortcut for the Gable Logistics dispatch terminal. I had designed the routing protocol myself in 2008, optimizing the fuel consumption curves for the Appalachian passes. A small white dialog box appeared in the center of the dark screen. Access denied. Invalid credentials. Contact system administrator. I stared at the words. I didn't click retry. I knew Beatrice's handwriting was behind that prompt. As the chief financial officer, my daughter was meticulous about security clearances, especially when those clearances belonged to a mother who had been voted off her own board of directors exactly 4 days ago. A quiet knock at the front door broke the silence of the kitchen. I didn't rush. I walked down the dim hallway, past the framed photographs of Gregory, Beatrice, and Julian's college graduations, expensive milestones funded by the very cargo routes they had just voted to restructure without me. When I opened the door, Beatrice was standing on the porch. She was dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit, her blonde hair pulled back into a sleek, efficient knot. She held 3 cardboard banker's boxes stacked neatly in her arms, her breathing slightly shallow from the walk up the driveway. "Mom?" she said, offering a tight, professional smile that lasted for precisely 2 seconds. "Good morning. I wanted to drop these off before the morning traffic got heavy." "Good morning, Beatrice," I said, stepping aside to let her into the foyer. She set the boxes on the bench near the coat rack. I recognized the labels. They were from my office, the large corner space on the second floor of the terminal that overlooked the loading docks. "Gregory felt it was best to get the personal effects cleared out before the regional auditors arrive on Friday," Beatrice said, her voice smooth, carrying the sterile, practiced neutrality she used during quarterly earnings calls. "We had to reallocate the space for the new logistics consultants we hired from Chicago." I looked down at the top box. Peeking out from beneath a stack of old leather-bound logbooks was the heavy brass paperweight shaped like a shipping container. The very first office accessory Harold had bought me when we rented our first dirt lot in 1991. "Gregory was too busy to bring them himself?" I asked softly. Beatrice adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, her eyes drifting toward her watch. "Gregory is coordinating the fleet modernization program, Mom. We're phasing out the older Peterbilt models. He's under a tremendous amount of pressure. We're just trying to make the transition as clean as possible for you." Clean. It was a corporate word for erasure. They wanted me to be comfortable, but more than that, they wanted me to be quiet. They wanted me to sit in this large empty house, polishing my chipped mugs and tending to the hydrangeas, while they dismantled the operational foundation Harold and I had spent our lives cementing. "I see," I said. "Thank you for bringing them, Beatrice." "Of course," she said, backing toward the door, her fingers already reaching for her phone. "We've set up the retirement disbursement schedule. The paperwork is in the second box. It's a very generous package, Mom. You won't have to worry about a thing." She slipped out the door, her electric car reversing down my gravel driveway with a low, whisper-soft hum that sounded nothing like the diesel engines that had built her trust fund. At 10 o'clock, I walked to the edge of my property, where the tree line met the highway leading to the industrial park. From the crest of the hill, I could see the Gable Logistics Terminal. A single white truck, Unit 408, was idling near the secondary bay. I didn't need binoculars to see that the driver was loading the trailer incorrectly. The rear axles were riding too low, the leaf springs compressed to their limit, while the nose of the trailer tilted upward. In the old days, I would have been down on the blacktop in my yellow safety vest within 3 minutes, instructing the dock foreman on proper load distribution. If you load a trailer nose light, the high-speed sway on the interstate will destroy the tires and burn through 40 gallons of fuel before the driver even crosses the state line. But I stood in the shade of the oaks and watched. Gregory walked out of the administrative building, holding a tablet, talking animatedly to a young man in a pristine polo shirt. Gregory didn't look at the trailer. He was gesturing toward the horizon, likely explaining his new digital dispatch system to the consultant. He didn't know that Unit 408 was about to blow a tire on the South Valley bypass. He didn't care about the physics of the load. He only cared about the metrics on his screen. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold, brass paperweight Beatrice had returned to me. Beneath the green velvet lining on the bottom of the paperweight was a small, flat, brass key. It was the key to a safety deposit box at the county bank, a box my late husband Harold had established in 1994, separate from the corporate holdings. Inside that box was the original, unrecorded deed to the 3-acre parcel of land directly adjacent to the Gable Logistics main terminal. It was the land Gregory had spent the last 3 months trying to buy from the county to build his new automated fulfillment center. He had assumed the county owned it. He didn't know that Harold had quietly bought the tax lien on that parcel 30 years ago and transferred the title to my maiden name. I turned and walked back to the house, the smell of diesel smoke drifting away in the morning wind. I spent the afternoon unboxing the personal effects Beatrice had left in my foyer. The framed photograph of Harold and me from our first terminal opening in 1991 had been packed at the bottom of the second box. The glass was cracked across the corner, a thin, jagged line slicing right through the image of Harold's hand resting on my shoulder. I ran my thumb over the fracture. It didn't break, but the edge was sharp enough to leave a small, bloodless indentation in my skin. Beneath the frame lay the Consultant Emeritus Agreement. I sat at the mahogany kitchen table, reading through Beatrice's clean, corporate typography. Section 12 was titled Covenant of Quietude. It was 5 pages of dense legalese that boiled down to a simple transaction. Gable Logistics would pay me $5,000 a month, and in return, I would forfeit my voting shares, agree to a 5-state non-compete clause, and sign a non-disparagement waiver that legally barred me from criticizing my own children's executive decisions. To Gregory and Beatrice, $5,000 a month was an act of profound filial charity. They truly believed they were paying me to rest. In reality, they were purchasing my silence, buying a legal muzzle to ensure the transition to Gregory's modernized era was completely uncontested. I laid the document on the table, next to my cracked photograph, and waited. At 2 o'clock, Julian arrived. My youngest son didn't park his company-leased sedan in my driveway. Instead, he left it idling on the street, as if he wanted to keep a safe, deniable distance between his vehicle's GPS tracker and my porch. He walked up the steps carrying a box of artisanal pastries from the French bakery near his downtown loft, his standard currency for smoothing over uncomfortable situations. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping into the kitchen and setting the bakery box on the counter. He was 27, dressed in a soft cashmere sweater, his face wearing the carefully cultivated look of casual concern he used for his brand consulting clients. "You look good. House is quiet, huh?" "It is, Julian," I said, pulling a clean mug from the cabinet. "Would you like some tea?" No, I'm good," he said, his eyes already drifting to the boxes in the foyer, then to the consultant emeritus folder on the dining table. He cleared his throat, a light, nervous sound. "Gregory's really hoping we can get that signed this week, Mom. Beatrice needs the executed copy before the board prints the annual shareholder report. It's about presenting a unified front. Investors get twitchy if they think there's any friction." "And you?" I asked, pouring my hot water. "Are you twitchy, Julian?" Julian laughed, a quick, performative sound that died when he realized I wasn't joining in. He looked down at his leather loafers. "Mom, come on. It's just how things are now. Gregory has these big plans for automation. He's talking about a virtual dispatch center that runs on artificial intelligence. The board loved it. It's the future." "And the drivers?" I asked. "The men who have been with us since we only had 3 trucks?" "We're streamlining," Julian said, his voice adopting Gregory's polished executive cadence. "We're offering them severance or the option to transition to contract owner-operators. It's cleaner on the balance sheet. Dad always said we have to adapt or die." "Your father said we have to adapt to the road, Julian," I said softly, sitting opposite him. "He never said we should starve the people who paved it." Julian's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone, his thumb tapping the screen before he caught himself and turned it face down on the table. "Look, Gregory is losing his mind over the South Valley expansion. The county land office is dragging its feet on the title verification for the 3-acre buffer lot we need for the fulfillment center. Gregory has 3 concrete crews on standby, and he's paying $5,000 a day in idle fees. We need everything else to be smooth, Mom. Please, just sign the paper. For the family." For the family. It was the same phrase they had used when they asked me to step down from the board temporarily after Harold's funeral, claiming they wanted to spare me the stress of the quarterly audits. "I will review it, Julian," I said. Julian sighed, a sound of heavy, youthful disappointment. He stood up, leaving the pastries untouched on the counter. "Don't take too long, Mom. Gregory is in no mood for roadblocks." 30 minutes after Julian left, I drove my old 8-cylinder sedan to the First County Bank on Main Street. The branch was a quiet, brick building that still smelled of damp wool and old paper. The vault was in the basement, reached by a narrow concrete staircase that my knees didn't particularly care for anymore. The vault teller, an older man named Douglas, who had approved our very first vehicle loan in 1993, greeted me with a respectful nod. He didn't ask about Gable Logistics. He didn't ask why my children's names were suddenly the only ones on the corporate stationery. He simply escorted me to the private viewing room and handed me my safety deposit box. I turned the heavy brass key Harold had left me. Inside the metal box were 3 yellowed folders. I bypassed the marriage certificate and the old family photographs, reaching for the deed to the South Valley parcel, the 3-acre buffer lot Gregory believed was county-owned land. The title was clean. It had been registered in 1994 under my maiden name, Diana Vance, and Harold had paid the property taxes out of a personal checking account every year until his death. I sat in the quiet of the viewing room, the single fluorescent bulb humming overhead. Psychological insight. Children who inherit an empire often confuse their parents' quietness with ignorance. Gregory and Beatrice believed that because I didn't boast about the foundations, I didn't know how deep they had been dug. They assumed that my life outside the corporate office was a blank slate, waiting to be written over by their spreadsheets. I pulled out my personal checkbook, the one linked to my private savings account, which currently held $612,000 of my own inherited family money. I looked at Douglas through the glass partition. Douglas, I need to register a new domestic entity. I want to establish North Star Logistics, LLC, and I want to transfer the South Valley deed to that LLC's portfolio by tomorrow morning. Douglas looked at the paperwork, then back at me, his eyes carrying a quiet, knowing glint. Under your maiden name, Diana? Yes, I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the light. Under my maiden name. Gregory didn't knock. He still had his key to my house, a convenience from the years when Harold and I would host Sunday dinners for the entire logistics crew. He pushed the front door open at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, his voice already carrying down the hallway before he had even crossed the threshold. He was on his phone, his tone a sharp, ragged bark that reminded me of Harold when the fuel prices skyrocketed in 2005. I don't care what the county records say, Dave. It's a buffer lot. It's been empty since the interstate was built. Gregory slammed his phone onto his belt clip and walked into the kitchen, his dark wool coat open, his silk tie slightly askew. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, my chipped mug in my hand. He looked at the dining table, his eyes immediately locking on to the Consultant Emeritus folder. It was still sitting exactly where Beatrice had left it, the blue pages clean and untouched. Mom, he said, his voice dropping into a tight, aggressive register. Why isn't this signed? Beatrice told me she dropped it off 48 hours ago. We need to file the quarterly transition report with the bank by noon. I am still reading it, Gregory, I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. Section 12 seems remarkably restrictive. Gregory let out a sharp, impatient breath, pacing the length of my kitchen. He stopped near the window, looking out toward the driveway. Restrictive? It's standard corporate protection, Mom. We're offering you $60,000 a year to do nothing. Most women your age would be booking a cruise, not auditing their own children. He turned to face me, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. I'm in the middle of a crisis here. Some out-of-state shell company called North Star Logistics just registered a title claim on our South Valley expansion lot. They filed an emergency injunction with the county court this morning. My concrete crews are sitting on their tailgates, costing me $5,000 a day, and the county sheriff just told our site manager we can't break ground until the title is cleared. I set my mug down. The ceramic made a small, dull clink against the mahogany table. That sounds like a significant oversight, Gregory. Did your legal team not verify the title before you scheduled the concrete? Gregory's face flushed a deep, angry red. He took 2 steps toward the table, leaning his hands on the back of the empty chair opposite me. We assumed the county owned it, Mom. It's been a designated municipal buffer since '94. Whoever this North Star group is, they're green-mailing us. They're trying to force us to buy them out at a premium. He pointed a finger at the folder on the table. I don't have time for this, and I don't have time for you to drag your feet on the retirement transition. If that document isn't signed and on Beatrice's desk by 5 tonight, I'm instructing her to suspend the corporate health insurance policy we have you on, and I'll have the locks changed on the family cabin at the lake. You're either with us or you're an outsider. Make a choice. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, his face wearing the cold, hard expression of a man who believed he held all the cards. 5 o'clock, Mom. Don't be stubborn. He turned and walked out of the house, the front door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the cracked photograph of Harold and me in the hallway. Psychological insight. My son did not see a mother anymore. He saw a legacy asset to be liquidated or a corporate liability to be mitigated. To children raised in the warmth of wealth, they did not have to build. Everything, even the woman who carried them, eventually becomes a contract to be negotiated. At noon, I drove to the Diesel Stop, a quiet, greasy spoon diner located 3 miles down the highway from the main Gable terminal. The air inside smelled of fried onions, old coffee, and diesel exhaust. Near the back booth sat Marcus Miller, our senior fleet mechanic. He was 58, his hands stained with engine grease that had settled permanently into the creases of his knuckles. He had worked for Harold and me since 1995, back when we only had 12 trucks and ran our maintenance out of a corrugated metal shed. When he saw me walk in, he stood up, sliding his baseball cap off his head. "Diana," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. "I was sorry to hear about the board's decision. It don't feel right, you not being at the terminal." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, sitting opposite him. "How are the drivers holding up with Gregory's new contract?" Marcus sighed, looking down at his chipped mug. "They're scared, Diana. Gregory is outsourcing the heavy maintenance to a third-party firm in Ohio. He told us we have to sign the new contract by Friday or we're out. The new daily wage is 30% lower, and the owner-operator insurance rates he's offering are highway robbery. Most of the senior guys, the guys who know how to run the mountain passes, they're talking about walking away." I reached into my handbag, pulled out a clean white business card, and slid it across the table. The card was simple. It held no logo, only a name and a phone number. North Star Logistics, LLC. Diana Vance, Managing Partner. Marcus picked up the card, his thick eyebrows knitting together as he read the name. He looked up at me, a sudden, sharp realization dawning in his gray eyes. "Diana, this is..." "I have just acquired 5 late-model Peterbilt tractors from an estate sale in West Virginia, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "They're sitting in the storage yard behind the old rail depot, and I need a head mechanic who knows how to keep them running." Marcus stared at the card, then looked back at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face. "How many drivers do you need, Diana?" "Start with 5, Marcus," I said. "The 5 best we have." At 5:01 p.m. on Monday, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was an email from Beatrice's personal assistant, though the signature block belonged to my daughter. The subject line was clinical. "Administrative offboarding. Status update." "Dear Mom," the text read, "since we did not receive the executed consultant emeritus agreement by the 5 p.m. deadline today, we have proceeded with the standard operational offboarding protocols as mandated by the board. Your corporate healthcare coverage will terminate at midnight tonight. The corporate line of credit has been deactivated, and the security codes for the lake house have been updated. If you choose to reconsider the terms of the agreement, please notify Gregory's office directly. Best, Beatrice." I read the email twice. I didn't feel a surge of anger. Instead, I felt a profound, cold clarity. Beatrice had always been exceptional with numbers. When she was 10, she spent her summer vacation cataloging the spare parts inventory in our maintenance shed, her small, precise handwriting filling 3 yellow legal pads. I had been so proud of her attention to detail back then. I hadn't realized that to Beatrice, the world was simply a collection of things to be cataloged, depreciated, and eventually written off. I closed my laptop, walked to the back door, and took my yellow, high-visibility safety vest from its hook. It was faded, smelling faintly of lavender laundry detergent and diesel oil. I was officially off-boarded. I was no longer a Gable. I was just Diana Vance. At 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning, I arrived at the old rail depot on the north side of town. The morning air was damp, the gravel parking lot covered in a low, clinging mist. Sitting in a neat row beneath the rusted iron awning of the transfer station were 5 black Peterbilt tractors. They weren't brand new, but they were immaculate. Marcus Miller had spent the entire night running the diagnostics, his green toolbox sitting open on the tailgate of his pickup truck. Standing near the first truck were 5 men: Ray, Hank, David, Leo, and Sam. Together, they represented over 120 years of driving experience. They were the men who had hauled our first refrigerated trailers through the winter blizzards of the Appalachians. The men who knew how to downshift on a 10% grade without burning out the brakes. They were holding paper coffee cups, their faces grim but steady as they watched my sedan pull up. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my safety vest. "Diana?" Ray said, stepping forward. He was 60, his face weathered by decades of highway sun. "Marcus told us what you're doing. We walked out on Gregory's contract yesterday afternoon. He told us we were easily replaced by owner-operators from the digital pool." "Nobody is easily replaced, Ray," I said, standing in front of them. "Not when the roads freeze over the pass." I looked at the 5 Peterbilts. They were heavy, powerful, and ready to move. "We start today," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet rail yard. "We are operating under North Star Logistics. Marcus has the routing sheets. We're going to run the same lanes we've run for 30 years, but we're going to do it with our own dispatch, our own maintenance, and our own names." Sam, the youngest of the drivers, let out a slow, quiet whistle. "Gregory's going to notice when his senior drivers are running under a different banner, Diana." "Let him notice, Sam," I said softly. "By the time he figures out where the trucks are coming from, we'll already have the freight." Psychological insight. Children who view their parents' legacy through the lens of a balance sheet do not understand that trust is a non-depreciable asset. Gregory and Beatrice believed that our clients belonged to the Gable name. They didn't understand that the clients belonged to the people who actually answered the phone at 3 in the morning when a shipment was stuck in a snowdrift. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the warehouse office of Valley Fresh Foods, the largest regional produce distributor in the state. Gordon Hayes, the company's managing director, was sitting behind a desk piled high with shipping manifests. He was a man of Harold's generation, blunt, loud, and constantly smelling of cigar smoke. Gable Logistics had handled his regional distribution for 22 years. When he saw me, he stood up, his face breaking into a wide, warm smile. "Diana! My God, it's good to see you. I heard what happened with Gregory and the board. I was going to call you, but, well, I didn't know if it was my place." "It's always your place, Gordon," I said, sitting in the leather chair opposite him. "How is your shipping run to the southern hub?" Gordon's smile vanished, replaced by a dark, heavy scowl. He threw his pen onto the desk. "It's a disaster, Diana. Gregory's new automated routing missed 3 of our grocery drops in Martinsburg last Thursday. The driver was running some computer-generated route that didn't account for the bridge construction on Route 9. We lost $60,000 in spoiled lettuce because the trailer sat on the asphalt for 6 hours." He leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. "Gregory's consultant told me it was an acceptable margin of systemic variance. I don't sell margins of variance, Diana. I sell fresh lettuce." I reached into my bag and placed our first North Star Logistics contract on his desk. "I have 5 Peterbilts sitting in the North Depot right now, Gordon," I said, keeping my voice calm, professional, and entirely steady. Ray and Hank are driving. Marcus Miller is handling the maintenance. We run on my original manual routing algorithms, the ones that don't rely on automated county data. Gordon looked at the contract, then up at me, a slow, knowing glint appearing in his eyes. You have the South Valley bypass covered? The South Valley bypass is entirely clear for North Star, I said, and we'll be at your loading dock at 4:45 tomorrow morning. Gordon picked up his pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page without reading a single line of the legal text. I've been waiting for someone to actually answer the phone, Diana. Welcome back. The cold morning air at the Valley Fresh warehouse smelled of damp cardboard and crushed parsley. At 4:45 a.m., I stood on the asphalt near the loading dock, my high-visibility safety vest zipped tight against the chill. Unit 01, our deep blue Peterbilt, backed into Bay 4 with a smooth, practiced precision that didn't require a single correction. Ray was at the wheel, his window rolled down, nodding quietly to the dock foreman as the hydraulic lift gates began to rattle. Gordon Hayes stood beside me, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his canvas jacket, a steaming paper cup of coffee in his hand. Perfect timing, Diana, he said, his voice low beneath the rhythmic purr of the truck's refrigeration unit. Gregory's digital dispatch didn't even have our truck scheduled until 7. My receivers in Martinsburg would have been sitting on empty hands. The road doesn't care about software schedules, Gordon, I said, watching Marcus Miller walk around the trailer, checking the tire pressure with a small steel gauge. It only cares about weight and timing. I felt a quiet, clean fatigue settling into my shoulders. It was the physical tiredness of useful work, a stark contrast to the hollow, suffocating exhaustion of sitting in my quiet kitchen, watching my children box up my life. For 35 years, this was where I belonged, on the blacktop, managing the movement of heavy things. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Beatrice's car pulled into my driveway. She didn't have her assistant send an email this time. She got out of the sedan herself, her leather heels clicking sharply on the gravel as she walked up the steps. When I opened the door, she didn't smile. Her face was tight, her eyes carrying a sharp, vibrating focus that I recognized from the years she had spent managing our corporate audits. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past me into the foyer, holding a black leather portfolio against her chest like a breastplate. Mom, she said, her voice dropping into a tense, hard whisper. We lost the Valley Fresh Foods account this morning. Gordon Hayes canceled our 20-year contract with 12 hours' notice. He said we were unreliable. He's right, Beatrice, I said, closing the front door and walking into the kitchen. You missed 3 of his Martinsburg drops last week. Beatrice followed me, her heels loud on the hardwood. He went to a new provider, some startup called North Star Logistics. They're using our senior drivers, Ray and Hank. Gregory is in a blind panic. He thinks you gave our private client list and driver payroll data to a competitor. I filled my chipped mug with hot water, not looking back at her. The Valley Fresh account isn't a secret, Beatrice. It's been listed on our corporate website under Key Partners since 1998. And the drivers didn't need a payroll leak to leave. Gregory tried to cut their mileage rate by 30%. Beatrice set her portfolio on the counter with a heavy, deliberate slap. Gregory is talking about clawing back your remaining shareholder equity. If you're coordinating with a competitor, it's a direct breach of your fiduciary duty to Gable Logistics. We can tie up your personal savings in corporate litigation for years, Mom. You won't have the liquidity to pay your property taxes, let alone hire a defense team. I turned to face my daughter. I looked at her expensive cashmere blazer, her gold watch, her polished leather shoes. All of it had been paid for by the very company she was threatening to use to bankrupt me. Beatrice, I said softly, go ahead and file the motion. Beatrice blinked, a small, uncertain twitch crossing her mouth. "Mom, I'm serious. Gregory is furious." "And I am retired, Beatrice," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. "But before your legal team files that motion, I suggest you review the minutes of the board meeting from last Tuesday. The meeting where you and Gregory voted to strip my executive authority and suspend my voting shares. You didn't have a quorum, Beatrice. Julian was in Chicago, and you didn't file the proxy notice. If you drag me into court, the first thing my attorney will do is invalidate your board transition." Beatrice's face went entirely pale. She stared at me, her mouth opening slightly, her fingers tightening around her portfolio. She had spent 10 years studying corporate law, but she had forgotten that I was the one who had drafted the company's original operating agreement in Harold's study. "Mom," she whispered, her voice losing its cold, executive edge. "You're trying to destroy us." "No, Beatrice," I said, my voice as quiet as the kitchen. "I am simply offboarding." At 7 o'clock that evening, Julian called my personal phone. His voice was thin, frantic, the casual confidence of the brand consultant completely gone. "Mom, are you there? Gregory is going crazy. He's locked himself in the main office with some executives from Midwest Freight Corp." My hand tightened on the receiver. "Midwest Freight?" "Yes," Julian hissed, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "They're a national logistics broker. Gregory is talking about selling them 49% of Gable Logistics operating stock to cover the South Valley concrete delays and the loss of the Valley Fresh route. They want to turn our terminals into automated transfer stations." Midwest Freight was notorious in our industry. They were asset strippers. They bought up family-owned transport firms, fired the local drivers, leased the fleets to third-party contract owner-operators, and ran the corporate shell into the ground while extracting the capital. "If he sells to them," I said quietly, "the Gable name is just a sticker on the side of their trailers. The business Harold built will be gone in 6 months." "I know, Mom!" Julian cried. "But Gregory won't listen to me. He says we need the capital infusion to bypass the South Valley block. Julianne, the board thinks it's our only option. You have to talk to him." "Gregory made his choice, Julian," I said, looking at the safety vest hanging by the back door. "Now he has to learn how to steer in the drift." The main Gable terminal on Thursday morning was a study in artificial activity. Under Gregory's direction, 2 administrative assistants had placed shiny blue Gable logistics banners over the rusted iron gates, and a crew of contract cleaners was sweeping the grease off the asphalt near the loading docks. It looked less like a working fleet yard and more like a film set waiting for the director to call action. I parked my old sedan in the visitor lot. Technically, I was there because Beatrice's HR manager had called my home 3 times before 8 o'clock. The company's pension fund ledger, established under our original 1991 charter, required my physical co-signature before the 5 departed drivers could receive their final payouts. Gregory's automated system had flagged the transaction as an unauthorized corporate distribution, and the bank had frozen the transfer. As I walked across the concrete, my yellow safety vest zipped to the collar, I saw Gregory walking near the maintenance bays. He was accompanied by Garrett Cole, a man of 48 with a sharp, angular face, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked remarkably out of place against the diesel exhaust. Cole was the lead acquisition executive for Midwest Freight Corp. Gregory was gesturing toward the bays, his voice loud, carrying the eager, thin pitch of a young man trying to sell a product he didn't fully understand. "And we're planning to convert these 3 bays into an automated, high-velocity sorting hub once the Midwest partnership is finalized. It'll increase our throughput by 40%. Gregory stopped when he saw me. His face went instantly rigid, his eyes narrowing into a look of cold, defensive panic. He took 3 fast steps toward me, his hands raised as if to physically redirect me away from his guest. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping into a tight, warning hiss. "What are you doing here? I told Beatrice to handle the final offboarding paperwork. You shouldn't be wandering around the terminal. It's an active liability." He turned to Garrett Cole, offering a quick, dismissive chuckle. "Garrett, this is my mother, Diana. She's retired now. She's having a bit of a hard time adjusting to the quiet life. Sometimes she still comes down here out of habit." He was telling Cole I was a senile old woman who didn't know where she was. He was using my presence as a tragic prop to show how much heavy lifting he was doing to drag this legacy company into the modern era. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," I said, ignoring Gregory entirely and offering Cole a firm, dry handshake. "I'm Diana Vance Gable. I founded this yard with my husband in 1991. Cole looked at my hand, then at my faded safety vest, a flicker of genuine curiosity crossing his sharp features. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Gable. Gregory has been telling me about your historical contributions." "I'm sure he has," I said softly. "But I'm not here out of habit, Gregory. I'm here because your HR department can't legally release the pension funds for Ray, Hank, and the other drivers without my signature on the original 91 charter." Gregory's jaw tightened, a small vein near his temple beginning to throb. "We're handling the administrative details in the boardroom, Mom. You don't need to discuss operational logistics with our potential partners." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it, Gregory," I said, turning back to Garrett Cole. "Though I'm surprised you're looking at these specific maintenance bays for conversion, Mr. Cole. Did Gregory's prospectus not mention that the municipal drainage easement runs directly beneath Bay 3? You can't lay automated concrete there without a federal environmental impact assessment. It takes about 18 months to clear the county permits, and that's if the soil is clean, which, given the 30 years of diesel runoff, it likely isn't." Cole's eyebrows shot up. He slowly turned his head to look at Gregory, his corporate warmth evaporating in an instant. "Is that true, Gregory? I thought the terminal survey was fully cleared for structural redevelopment." Gregory's face went a dark, heavy purple. It's a minor administrative detail, Garrett. We have our engineering team reviewing the zoning. It's completely under control." "And I'm sure your engineers will also mention," I added quietly, "that the South Valley buffer lot, the 3 acres Gregory promised would be your new automated sorting yard, is currently held under an active title injunction by North Star Logistics. They own the private deed. You can't break ground there, Mr. Cole. Not today, and not next year." Psychological insight. To an insecure man, a mother's knowledge is a threat that must be pathologized. If Gregory could not control my memory, he had to try to convince the world it was madness. But the pavement doesn't care about his corporate stories. It only cares about the weight of the load, and the drainage ditch beneath Bay 3 was very real. Garrett Cole looked at Gregory, then back at me, his eyes carrying a cold, professional assessment. He pulled his phone from his breast pocket and tapped the screen. "Gregory," Cole said, his voice dropping into a flat, clinical register. "We need to pause the tour. I think we have some significant gaps in our preliminary due diligence. I'm going to have my legal team review the South Valley title filings before we schedule the next board presentation." "Garrett, wait," Gregory pleaded, his hands open, his voice cracking slightly. "We can clear this. It's just a temporary hurdle." "We'll talk in the office," Cole said, turning and walking back toward the administrative building with a fast, determined stride. Gregory stood on the asphalt, his chest rising and falling in shallow, angry breaths. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a raw, ugly hatred that had stripped away the last of his executive polish. "You're destroying this family, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying, impotent rage. "You're ruining everything we built." "No, Gregory," I said, turning to walk toward the administration lobby to sign my driver's pension releases. "You built a house of cards on my driveway. I'm just opening the door to let the wind in." In the small, windowless human resources office of the Gable terminal, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial toner. I sat at the metal desk, systematically signing the original pension release forms for Ray, Hank, David, Leo, and Sam. My fingers were steady, my handwriting identical to the signature I had placed on the company's incorporation charter 33 years ago. The door opened, and Beatrice stepped inside. She didn't have her black leather portfolio now, and her eyes were underlined by dark purple hollows of exhaustion. She leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "The bank has verified your signatures, Mom," she said, her voice thin, stripped of its corporate confidence. "The funds will be released to the drivers by 3 o'clock. "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, capping my pen and placing it in my handbag. "I'm glad we could resolve this cleanly." Beatrice let out a short, bitter breath. "Cleanly? You just blew up our negotiation with Midwest Freight. Garrett Cole called Gregory's office from the airport. They've suspended the due diligence review until we can resolve our internal title ambiguities. Our stock valuation is dropping, and the board is panicking." She took a step closer, her voice dropping into a cold, hard whisper. "Gregory and I have decided to cancel the public memorial service for Dad next week. We were going to host it at the country club, but we're moving it to a private reception at the lake house." I looked at my daughter. "The lake house? The house Harold and I spent 3 years building?" "Yes," Beatrice said, her chin lifting in a defensive, ugly gesture. "And we've decided to keep the guest list strictly to active corporate stakeholders and members of the new advisory board. Since you declined the consultant emeritus agreement, you are no longer an active stakeholder in Gable Logistics, Mom. It's a corporate function now. It would be inappropriate for you to be there." She was uninviting me from my own husband's memorial service. She was using the house I had painted with my own hands to host a business meeting, locking me out of Harold's memory because I refused to let them erase my work. I stood up, smoothing the front of my safety vest. I looked at Beatrice, my eyes calm and empty of the tears she was undoubtedly bracing herself to fight. "I hope the weather is clear for the reception, Beatrice," I said softly, walking past her into the hallway. Harold always preferred the lake when the water was still. At the North Star Rail Depot, the silence was broken by the beautiful, deep rumble of 6 Peterbilt engines idling in unison. Marcus Miller was standing near the tool shed, a massive, grease-stained grin on his weathered face as I walked up. He had 3 more driver files open on his clipboard. "Diana," he said, pointing to the blue trucks. "We just cleared our 3rd regional run for Valley Fresh Foods. Gordon Hayes called. He wants to transfer his entire Appalachian orchard distribution to us by Monday morning. That's 15 more refrigerated loads a week." He tapped the clipboard. "And 3 more of Gregory's senior drivers, Pete, Gary, and Thomas, just turned in their keys at the main terminal. They heard we're paying 40 cents a mile more than Gregory's contract, and they want to know if we have trucks for them." "Get the trucks, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "I have the cash. We'll lease 3 more tractors from the regional pool by tomorrow morning." "Gregory is running out of drivers, Diana," Marcus said, his eyes carrying a quiet, fierce satisfaction. "He's having to use third-party owner-operators who don't know the mountain routes. He's already got 2 loads of steel stuck on the ridge because the drivers didn't know how to chain their tires." "Gregory is learning the cost of the road, Marcus," I said. "Keep our dispatch tight." At 6 o'clock that evening, my prepaid phone rang. It was Julian. He was in tears, his voice raw and hyperventilating. "Mom, Gregory fired me. He cut my department's budget to zero and told me my branding agency was unnecessary corporate bloat. Beatrice voted with him. They're trying to save every penny to cover the Midwest audit delays. He let out a ragged sob. I don't have my company car anymore, Mom. They're shutting down my health care at midnight. I voted with them because I thought we were building something together. I thought they cared about me. Psychological insight. When a family built on transactional relationships turns inward, they eventually begin to consume their own. Julian had believed his loyalty bought him safety. He didn't understand that to Gregory and Beatrice, he was never a brother. He was simply a line item that had finally become too expensive to carry. You can stay in my guest room, Julian, I said, my voice gentle. But you have to tell me what Gregory is planning next. Julian took a shaky breath, his voice dropping into a terrified whisper. Gregory is completely unhinged, Mom. He knows the sheriff is going to serve the formal South Valley court injunction on Monday morning. He's hired a private, non-union night crew. He's bringing 3 bulldozers and 4 concrete trucks to the South Valley lot tonight at midnight. At midnight? I asked. Yes, Julian hissed. He's going to grade the buffer lot and pour the foundation in the dark before the court can enforce the hold. He thinks if the concrete is already down, the judge won't force him to tear it up. He's going to violate the injunction tonight. I looked at the mahogany kitchen table, where my cracked photograph of Harold sat in the quiet light. Gregory was going to break the law on my land, believing his corporate urgency made him immune to the consequences. But he had forgotten that the local sheriff, Arthur Miller, was Harold's first cousin, and the man who had helped us clear our very first terminal lot 30 years ago. Thank you, Julian, I said softly, reaching for my handbag. Get some sleep. The morning is going to be very loud. At midnight, the South Valley buffer lot was pitch black, smelling of damp clay and pine needles. The low, rhythmic rumble of heavy diesel engines began to vibrate through the trees as 3 yellow bulldozers and 2 concrete mixers crawled off the main road, their headlights cutting bright, dusty paths through the mist. Gregory stood near the entrance of the lot, his dark wool coat zipped to his chin, his arm waving the lead bulldozer forward into the center of my property. Then, the woods erupted in red and blue strobe lights. 4 sheriff's cruisers swept out from behind the rusted transfer station, their sirens silent, but their flashing lights painting the trees in a frantic, blinding strobe. The heavy machinery ground to a sudden halt, the engines idling down into a low, confused growl. Sheriff Arthur Clayton stepped out of the lead cruiser, his hand resting on his belt, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist to illuminate Gregory's pale, frozen face. I sat in the passenger seat of Arthur's patrol SUV, my yellow safety vest zipped up, watching through the dark glass. "Shut the engines down," Arthur's voice boomed through his megaphone. "Step away from the machinery. Everyone stand where you are." Gregory took 3 stumbling steps toward Arthur's vehicle, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic, desperate explanation. "Sheriff Clayton, what is this? This is county land. We have an active grading easement." Arthur Clayton walked forward, his flashlight beam dropping to the gravel near Gregory's leather boots. "This isn't county land, Gregory. This 3-acre parcel belongs to Diana Vance. It has since 1994. You're currently in violation of a standing county title injunction, and you're committing criminal trespass with heavy machinery." Gregory froze, his head snapping toward the patrol SUV. He couldn't see me through the tinted glass, but he knew I was there. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his shoulders sagging, his hands slowly dropping to his sides. "You have 15 minutes to get this equipment off Mrs. Vance's property, Gregory," Sheriff Clayton said, his voice cold and official. If these engines are still running in 20 minutes, I'm impounding the machinery and booking you for felony trespass and malicious mischief. The non-union crew didn't wait for Gregory's executive direction. They immediately put the bulldozers into reverse, their backup beepers echoing through the dark woods as they retreated toward the highway, leaving my son standing alone in the cold mud. At 8 o'clock on Friday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping my tea from my chipped mug. The front door opened. Gregory's key was gone, but Beatrice didn't bother to knock. She pushed through the door, her hair uncombed, her eyes wide, with a raw, breathless panic that stripped away every ounce of her CFO composure. She collapsed into the chair opposite me, her hands shaking as she set her leather portfolio on the mahogany. "Mom," she gasped, her voice cracking. "Gregory was detained by the county sheriff last night. They're filing formal trespass and zoning violation charges. The local paper is already calling the corporate office for a statement." She leaned forward, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "If Gregory gets indicted, Midwest Freight is going to terminate the acquisition agreement immediately. They have a standard morality and compliance clause. We'll lose the cash infusion, Mom. We won't be able to pay the diesel suppliers for next month's runs. We're going to go under." I took a slow, quiet sip of my tea. "That sounds like an operational crisis, Beatrice. Perhaps Gregory should have verified the deed before he brought the bulldozers." "Mom, please," Beatrice cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes, her cold, analytical mask completely shattering. "You have to tell Sheriff Clayton to drop the charges. Tell him it was a family misunderstanding. We'll give you the consultant emeritus agreement back. We'll double the monthly payment. We'll restore your medical insurance today. Just, please, stop this. We're your children." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the raw desperation in her eyes, the sudden, frantic appeal to a maternal instinct she had spent months dismissing as sentimental overhead. Psychological insight. When children who view their parents as transactional assets lose their leverage, they do not suddenly become loving. They simply become desperate. They mistake their own terror of bankruptcy for reconciliation, hoping that the mother they discarded will still be willing to starve so they can remain comfortable. "I don't want the consultant emeritus agreement, Beatrice," I said softly. "And I don't want the corner office." Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening slightly, her breath hitching. "Then what do you want, Mom? What is this?" "I want you to understand the physics of the road, Beatrice," I said, leaning back in my chair. "This morning at 9 o'clock, Douglas at First County Bank called my private office. He informed me that Gable Logistics' $4 million line of credit, the one secured by the main terminal property Harold and I built, has gone into technical default because you missed the Q3 compliance filing during your audit delays." Beatrice's face went entirely gray. Douglas wouldn't authorize a foreclosure. We've been with First County for 30 years. "Douglas didn't authorize it, Beatrice," I said, my voice as quiet as the kitchen. "I did. North Star Logistics has just purchased Gable's outstanding debt from First County Bank. As of 9:15 this morning, I am no longer your mother on the retirement list. I am your primary creditor." Beatrice's phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany table. The screen lit up with Gregory's name in bold black letters. She stared at the phone, then slowly looked up at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying, silent realization. She finally understood that the quiet woman they had tried to erase had quietly bought the ground they were standing on. Beatrice tapped the screen, her finger trembling as she put Gregory's call on speakerphone. The kitchen was instantly filled with the frantic, distorted bark of my eldest son's voice, his executive composure completely shattered. He was calling from his attorney's office, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Beatrice, are you there?" Gregory yelled, a tight, vibrating panic in his tone. "The lawyer is trying to file the bail terms, but the corporate visa is declined. What the hell is going on with the accounting systems? I need $5,000 for the retainer, and the concrete foreman is threatening to dump his loads on our main terminal driveway if we don't pay him by 10 o'clock. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes wide, her voice shaking as she leaned toward the phone. "Gregory? The cards are declined because First County Bank has declared an administrative default on our line of credit." "What?" Gregory barked. "Douglas can't do that. I'll call his regional director. We've been with First County for 30 years. "Gregory," Beatrice whispered, a tear dropping onto her leather portfolio. "Douglas didn't do it. Mom did. North Star Logistics purchased our debt this morning. Mom is our primary creditor. She owns the default." A heavy, static-filled silence stretched over the line. I could hear Gregory's ragged breathing, the sudden stunned quiet of his attorney's office in the background. The man who had walked into my kitchen 36 hours ago to threaten my health insurance was suddenly standing on a floor that had completely evaporated beneath him. When he spoke again, his voice was a thin, raspy whisper. "Mom? You bought the note?" I reached out and picked up the phone. "I bought the note, Gregory. And the concrete trucks need to be turned around before 10 o'clock, or I'll have Sheriff Clayton impound them for environmental hazard on my terminal property." I tapped the screen, ending the call, and set the phone back on the mahogany table. Julian walked into the kitchen then, holding a chipped ceramic mug of coffee. He was staying in my guest room, his clothes slightly wrinkled, his face pale but carrying a look of quiet, sober relief. He looked at Beatrice, who sat frozen in her chair, staring at the empty space where the phone had been. "Beatrice," Julian said softly, "you look like you just saw Dad's ghost. Did Mom tell you about the default?" Beatrice didn't answer. She was a woman who lived by spreadsheets, and she had just realized her mother owned the ledger. Julian turned to me, his hands tightening around his mug. "Mom, there's something else you need to know. Yesterday, before Gregory fired me, I found a real estate listing agreement in Beatrice's scent mail. They had already hired an estate agent to put the lake house on the market next week." I looked at Julian, my hands remaining perfectly still on my lap. "The lake house?" "Yes," Julian said, his voice dropping into a tight, disgusted whisper. "They were going to list it for $1.2 million to cover their cash flow deficit before the Midwest freight deal closed. They were going to sell it and tell you the foundation had failed and it was too dangerous for you to visit. They were going to sell Dad's legacy while lying to your face." I looked at Beatrice. She didn't deny it. She looked down at her polished shoes, her shoulders shaking slightly as she pulled her arms tighter around herself. Psychological insight. To children raised in the absolute security of wealth, a parent's legacy is not a sacred trust. It is simply a liquid asset waiting to be traded for another quarter of comfort. They did not build the walls, so they could not understand that the lake house was not made of wood and stone. It was made of Harold's sweat and 30 years of my quiet endurance. "I see," I said softly. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, I walked into the Gable Logistics boardroom. The room sat on the second floor of the terminal, overlooking the loading docks where two of my blue North Star Peterbilts were currently loading fruit from Valley Fresh Foods. Gregory sat at the head of the mahogany table, looking exhausted, his dark wool coat gone, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from his night in the sheriff's annex. Beatrice sat beside him, her head lowered. Julian sat on my side of the table, holding a yellow legal pad. I did not wear my safety vest today. I wore a simple, dark-tailored suit, the one Harold had bought me for our silver wedding anniversary. I placed the heavy brass shipping container paperweight in the exact center of the table. Gregory tried to stand, but his knees seemed weak, and he sank back into his leather chair. "Mom," he said, his voice raspy, trying to force a tone of professional accommodation. "Look, we can restructure the payment. We can negotiate a payment plan for the default. There's no need to destroy the company over a family dispute." "We are not here to negotiate, Gregory," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the absolute weight of the room. Under Section 8 of our credit agreement, since the default is active, the creditor has the immediate right to appoint an interim receiver or restructure the executive committee. I slid a single white document across the table. It stopped precisely in front of him. "Gregory, you will resign as Chief Executive Officer of Gable Logistics, effective at 5 o'clock tonight," I said. "Beatrice, you will remain as CFO, but your daily spending authorization is capped at $500, and every corporate transaction must be co-signed by Marcus Miller, whom I have appointed as our new Chief of Operations." Gregory flinched as if I had struck him. "Marcus? You're putting a grease monkey in charge of my father's company?" "Marcus has been running the mechanics of this company for 30 years, Gregory," I said softly. "He knows how to keep the trucks on the road. You only know how to keep them in court." Gregory stared at the resignation paper, his fingers twitching against his knees. "And if I refuse to sign?" "If you refuse," I said, leaning forward, "I will execute the foreclosure on the terminal land at 9:01 on Monday morning. I will padlock the gates, impound the fleet, and Gable Logistics will cease to exist before the bank opens." I stood up, picking up the brass paperweight. "And one more thing, Gregory. Your father's memorial service is moving back to the country club next Wednesday. It will be open to all our drivers, our mechanics, and our retired staff. But you and Beatrice are not on the guest list." On Monday morning, Marcus Miller moved into the corner office on the second floor of the Gable Administrative Building. He didn't touch Gregory's high-backed leather chair, nor did he remove the minimalist digital art hanging on the walls. Instead, he placed a grease-stained blue shop rag on the pristine glass desk, set his battered green metal toolbox on the credenza, and laid out his old magnetic routing board, the one Harold and I had built in 1998. I sat in the small armchair by the window, holding my chipped ceramic mug. Outside, the yard was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of diesel engines. The blue Gable banners Gregory had hung for the Midwest freight executives had been taken down, replaced by our original faded yellow safety flags. "We've got 18 flatbeds cleared for the Southern Pass today, Diana," Marcus said, his gravelly voice sounding remarkably solid in the quiet office. "Ray is leading the convoy. Gordon Hayes called from Valley Fresh. He's shifting their entire Mid-Atlantic refrigerated division to us by Wednesday. We're going to need 5 more owner-operators to cover the volume." "We'll hire them, Marcus," I said, watching a truck clear the main gate, its exhaust puffing black and healthy into the cold morning air. "Gregory's automated routing servers are officially offline. We go back to the manual boards." The office door opened and Beatrice stepped inside. She looked exhausted. She was wearing the same navy pantsuit from Friday, her hair slightly unkempt, her eyes dark and hollow. She held a single sheet of paper in her hand, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the folder. Under the new credit terms, she could not authorize any corporate transaction over $500 without Marcus's co-signature. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the desk and slid the paper across the glass toward Marcus. "This is the invoice for the West Valley diesel delivery," she said, her voice thin, trembling slightly. "The supplier is refusing to release the fuel tanks without a certified bank draft. It's $12,000. Marcus picked up the paper, checked the gallon rate against his clipboard, and then signed his name at the bottom in thick, black ink. He slid the folder back to her without saying a word. Beatrice took the folder, her chin trembling as she finally turned to look at me. "Are you happy now, Mom? You've put a grease monkey in Dad's chair and left me begging for permission to pay the fuel bills. You're treating your own children like untrustworthy employees." I took a slow sip of my tea. "I'm treating you like managers, Beatrice. You're just learning the price of the ink." "This is humiliating," she whispered, a hot, bitter tear spilling over her cheek. "We built this company's modern financial structure. We brought in the auditors. We made us look like a real corporation." Psychological insight. To Beatrice, trust was a corporate asset she believed she was naturally entitled to hold. She didn't understand that when you try to sell your father's legacy and pack up your mother's silver behind her back, you forfeit the right to hold the pen. She had spent her life measuring margins, but she had never learned that the most expensive thing on a balance sheet is a broken promise. "You made us look like a target, Beatrice," I said softly. "Now, go pay the diesel supplier." She turned and fled the office, the door clicking shut behind her with a soft, clean sound. At 3 o'clock, I drove to the lake house. The autumn leaves had fallen thick across the long gravel driveway, the woods silent and gray under a heavy sky. The house sat cold near the dark water, smelling of cedar and dust. I walked into the garage. Stacked near the workbench were 3 black industrial trash bags. I walked over, knelt on the cold concrete, and pulled the tie on the first bag. Inside were Harold's personal things. His hand-carved cedar duck decoys, his old wool flannel shirts, his high school track medals, his collection of vintage brass compasses. Gregory had thrown them in the trash, clearing the garage to stage the house for the luxury estate market. I felt a tight, cold pain in my chest, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. I sat on an upturned wooden crate, my fingers tracing the carved wing of a cedar mallard. I reached into the bag and pulled out Harold's old green tackle box, the one he had taken to the lake every Sunday morning for 30 years. I opened the brass latches, breathing in the scent of rubber lures, motor oil, and rusted steel hooks. In the very bottom compartment, beneath the spare line, was a flat, yellowed envelope. I opened it, expecting to find old fishing licenses. Instead, I pulled out 3 stock certificates for Midwest Freight Corps, dated August 14th, 2011. Beneath them was a handwritten letter from the founder of Midwest Freight, addressed to Harold. "Harold," the letter read, "we have the proxy block secure. If you sign the integration agreement, we can merge Gable into Midwest and retire with $40 million in liquid assets. Diana doesn't need to know the details until the funds clear. She's too sentimental about the local routes, but we both know the future is in the national grid. Let me know when you're ready to execute the transfer." I stared at the paper. The yellowed ink was Harold's elegant, sweeping script on the margin, where he had written, "Waiting for the right timing. Need to clear the South Valley parcel first." The world seemed to go entirely still. My late husband, the man I had spent 35 years building a life with, The man whose memory I was currently fighting to protect had been planning his own secret buyout with Midwest Freight years before our children had ever entered the boardroom. The betrayal had not started with Gregory and Beatrice. It had started with Harold. I sat on the upturned wooden crate in the freezing lake house garage for a long time, the yellowed letter from 2011 held in my cold fingers. The wind off the water rattled the loose metal siding of the garage, a lonely, hollow sound that seemed to echo inside my own chest. Sentimental. That was the word Harold had used to describe me to the Midwest Freight executives. It was the exact word Gregory had used in my kitchen just days ago. My children had not invented the language of my dismissal. They had inherited it. They had spent their lives watching their father treat me like a treasured archivist, the woman who kept the trucks running and the domestic margins clean, while quietly planning to sell the entire foundation from beneath my feet the moment the numbers made sense. Harold had spent 30 years letting me believe we were partners, but to him, I was simply an overhead cost to be managed until his exit strategy cleared. Psychological insight. We do not grieve the people we lose. We grieve the illusions we built around them. My fight to protect Harold's legacy had been a war to defend a ghost who had already sold his weapon to the enemy. But as I folded the yellowed envelope and slid it into my handbag, the lingering warmth of my grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy armor. I was no longer defending a legacy. I was building my own. On Wednesday afternoon, the Oak Ridge Country Club was filled with the low, deep murmur of 50 transport workers. The ballroom smelled of cedar reeds, coffee, and wet wool. Marcus Miller stood near the entrance, greeting retired drivers who had traveled across 3 states to attend. These were the men with calloused hands and weathered faces, the people who had actually built Gable Logistics with their miles. I stood near the vestibule, my charcoal wool suit clean and pressed, my chipped ceramic mug sitting on the small table beside the guest book. The double doors opened, and Gregory and Beatrice stepped inside. They were not on the guest list, but they had come anyway. They looked hollowed out. Gregory's eyes were bloodshot and framed by dark circles, his tailored suit hanging loose on his shoulders. Beatrice looked pale, her fingers clutched tightly around her designer handbag. They didn't walk into the ballroom. They stopped in the vestibule, looking at me with a mix of desperate, burning resentment and raw terror. Gregory stepped forward, his voice a low, raspy hiss that didn't carry into the main room. "Mom, you uninvited us from our own father's memorial? After you took my company? You're a monster." "Dad would hate what you're doing, Mom," Beatrice whispered, her chin trembling as she tried to maintain her analytical composure. "He built Gable Logistics for us. He wanted us to carry the Gable name into the next generation." I looked at my children. I looked at their expensive clothes, their polished shoes, their absolute certainty that they were the rightful heirs to a kingdom they had never had to bleed for. I reached into my handbag, pulled out the yellowed envelope from Harold's green tackle box, and laid it on the guest book table. "He didn't build it for you, Beatrice," I said, my voice as calm and quiet as the autumn rain. "Read page 2. Beatrice frowned, her fingers hesitant as she pulled the yellowed paper from the envelope. Gregory leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the elegant, sweeping script of his father's handwriting. As they read, the silence in the vestibule became heavy, suffocating. I watched Gregory's face drain of what little color he had left. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes moving back and forth across the page, as if trying to find a mistake in the ledger. This is from 2011, Gregory stammered, his voice cracking, losing its executive authority entirely. He was going to sell? Before I even finished my MBA? He was going to merge us into Midwest Freight? He was going to sell the moment the South Valley parcel was cleared, Gregory, I said softly. The very parcel you tried to illegally pave on Monday night. He didn't build this company for your future. He built it as his personal $40 million exit strategy. He was going to leave you with nothing but a trust fund. Beatrice dropped the paper onto the table, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with a blank, terrified realization. The myth of their devoted father, the foundation of their entire corporate identity, had just crumbled into yellowed dust. But I didn't let him sell then, I said, picking up my chipped mug. And I'm not letting you sell now. I looked at my son and daughter, their faces frozen in the dim light of the country club vestibule. Douglas at First County Bank helped me execute the proxy transfers this morning, I said quietly. Those Midwest Freight shares your father kept hidden in his tackle box represent a 3% voting block in their corporate registry. I've just traded those shares to Garrett Cole's board in exchange for their complete withdrawal from our territory. Midwest is pulling out of the tri-state area, and North Star Logistics is absorbing Gable's regional routes. Julian is running our new brand strategy, I added. Marcus is running operations. You two, you have 30 days to clear your offices. Gregory stared at me, his eyes wide, a strange cold light suddenly appearing in his gaze. He slowly looked toward the lake house keys in my handbag, a tight, desperate smile touching his lips. The lake house, he whispered, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. You think you've won everything, Mom. But you forgot about the private safe in Dad's study at the lake, the one beneath the floorboards. You don't have the combination. And what's inside that safe will destroy your precious North Star before Monday morning. Gregory did not wait for the end of his father's memorial service. He slipped out of the country club vestibule while the first slide of the memorial presentation was playing, his car tires throwing gravel as he roared out of the parking lot toward the lake. He believed he still held the final, devastating ledger. He believed that inside the private safe beneath the study floorboards lay the document that would dismantle North Star Logistics and restore his corporate crown. By the time I arrived at the lake house 2 hours later, the autumn sun had dipped below the tree line, leaving the water dark and cold. I walked into Harold's study. The air smelled of cedar, old paper, and freshly splintered pine. Gregory was kneeling in the corner, his wool coat discarded on the floor, his hands covered in sawdust and sweat. He had used a crowbar from the garage to pry up the mahogany floorboards, exposing the heavy green steel door of the dial safe. He was frantically spinning the dial, his eyes wild, his fingers trembling so violently he kept missing the numbers. "Gregory," I said softly from the doorway. He snapped his head toward me, a ragged, breathless laugh escaping his throat. "I'm in, Mom. I'm almost in. Dad told me about the safe before he died. He said what's inside would protect the family from any unauthorized transitions. He was talking about you. He knew you'd try to hold us back." I walked into the room, my old yellow safety vest still zipped to my collar, and sat in Harold's leather armchair. I placed my chipped ceramic mug on the desk. "The combination is 41-20-91, Gregory," I said. Gregory froze, his hands stopping on the dial. He looked at me, his eyes wide and blank. How do you know that?" "I set the lock, Gregory," I said, my voice as quiet as the lake. "In 1998, when we built this house, your father never could remember numbers. He used the date of our very first regional dispatch run, April 12th, 1991. I pointed to the safe. Turn it left to 41, right to 20, left to 91. Gregory's hands shook as he followed my instructions. The heavy steel bolt gave a loud metallic clunk, and the door swung open, exposing a single thick leather binder. Gregory reached inside, his fingers clutching the binder as if it were a life raft. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page, expecting to find the corporate weapon that would destroy me. But as he read, the frantic triumph on his face slowly evaporated, replaced by a gray, hollow incomprehension. Beatrice stepped into the study then, her coat open, her face pale as she looked from the torn-up floorboards to the open safe. "Gregory? What is it? Did you find the dissolution contract?" Gregory didn't answer. He let the binder slip from his fingers, the pages fluttering open on the dusty floorboards. He sank back onto his heels, his head dropping into his hands, a low, broken sound escaping his throat. I reached down, picked up the binder, and turned to the final page. "You thought your father was planning to sell the company in 2011 to leave you with nothing? Because he didn't trust my operational judgment," I said to Beatrice, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "But you didn't read the trust addendum your father drafted in this study 2 weeks before his death." I looked down at Harold's elegant, sweeping handwriting on the final page of the ledger, and I began to read aloud. "To my children, Gregory, Beatrice, and Julian. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have attempted to restructure Gable Logistics by removing your mother from her office. I spent 20 years watching you grow into adults who measure love in margins and respect in corporate titles. I knew that the moment my chair was cold, your greed would drive you to offboard the very woman who built your world." I looked up at Beatrice. Her eyes were wide, wet with a sudden, suffocating realization. I turned back to the page. "Therefore, I have structured our technical debt, the South Valley deed, and our Midwest freight proxy blocks so that any unilateral attempt to strip Diana of her voting rights will immediately trigger a technical default, transferring all operating assets to her maiden name. You cannot inherit what you do not respect. If you want your seats back at Gable Logistics, you will have to earn them at your mother's kitchen table." The study went completely, beautifully silent. The wind off the lake rattled the glass, but inside, the air was still. Gregory was on his knees, his forehead resting against the cold steel of the safe, his chest rising and falling in silent, defeated sobs. Beatrice stood in the doorway, her hands clutching her designer bag, her cold, analytical mind finally realizing that their father had spent his final days building a fortress to protect their mother from their own greed. Harold had not betrayed me. He had known exactly who our children were. He had known they would try to erase me, and he had laid the operational pavement so that every move they made to push me out would only draw the trap tighter around their own throats. He had left the ledger in my hands because he knew I was the only one who knew how to steer the fleet. I stood up, picking up my father's old leather suitcase and my chipped ceramic mug. I looked at my son and daughter, the managers who had tried to catalog my life and write me off as a depreciated asset. They were no longer executives. They were simply children, standing in the dark, waiting for their mother to tell them what to do next. "The lake house is not for sale," I said, walking past Beatrice into the hallway. "And neither am I. I'll see you at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, Beatrice. We have 40 tons of freight to move."